Okay. All right, we are back on another Monday for another talk. And today we're going to talk about something that is very, very common. This is one of those things that I think is even as common as it is. It is under talk. It is not talked about enough, and I do think it, in some ways, is the root of a lot of what is going on, and that when it comes to gut health, and then things further downstream. And what I mean by that, we'll kind of get into it in a minute, but we got to start by talking about what GERD is, what reflux is. And that's going to be the focus of today's little talk here. So, roughly right now, what we're looking at is somewhere, at least in America, 15-30% of Americans experience reflux, gastroesophageal reflux disease, more commonly called heartburn. So something it could happen daily, it could happen weekly. Either way, this is a pretty high number, and it's going to be really important because this is going to lead to downstream issues, is particularly in the gut, kind of down the road when it comes to gut health. So the most common causes of things like GERD are going to be poor eating habits. It can actually happen when you're pregnant, so something worth talking about or knowing about. Hiatal hernias and low stomach acid levels. So this is a big one. This is something that we're going to get into, a little later here. There's a lot of different symptoms that can come about with GERD. So we got things like bloating, flatulence, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, hair loss, heartburn, of course, acne. It could even lead to things like autoimmune issues down the road, allergies and sensitivities, acne, deficiencies in things like vitamin B12, in iron. It could lead to fatigue. So, you could be, tired, more lethargic. It could even lead to itching. But what is happening with GERD? So, the lower esophageal sphincter, which is essentially the opening that goes from the esophagus into the stomach, it remains open. And when that does not close properly, as a consequence, kind of when we eat, food and stomach acid can kind of come back in to the esophagus because that opening is not closed. So it gets regurgitated, hence the name regurgitation, reflux. So this is what leads to that feeling of heartburn. It could also lead to bad breath. It could lead to irritation of both the esophagus and even your gums and your mouth if you're getting that reflux, all the way back into your mouth. That can lead to a more acidic environment, particularly in the mouth. That could lead to issues down the road. It could lead to something known as Barrett's esophagus, which is some serious damage done to the esophageal lining, the cells that line the esophagus. It could even lead to esophageal cancer over time. So those cells, particularly towards the bottom of the esophagus, that are kind of one type of cell, if they're exposed over and over again to stomach acid, they can actually become a little bit dysplastic and change over time. And, when there should be, those types of cells, if they're changing, that kind of leads to a situation where you could potentially end up with esophageal cancer. So, what's going on here with this? Now, a lot of the medications, a lot of the over the counter drugs that are used for GERD, now, these are really good at giving you some kind of temporary relief, especially short term for these symptoms. But what at the cost usually of damage long term. So, there's a cost benefit analysis here. It's are you going to get some short term benefit, but at what cost to your health long term? So these are kind of the cost benefits and cost benefit analyses that we have to do to just kind of understand where we're coming from and see what we can do to ideally mitigate further damage. Because what happens is when you take proton pump inhibitors, antacids, H2 blockers on a regular basis over, months and years, this can lead to an issue creating enough stomach acid. And when you have that happen, then you're opening the floodgates to potential gut issues all the way down the digestive tract past the stomach. So whether it's liver or gallbladder or small intestine or pancreas or colon, dysbiosis, SIBO, all of these things are becoming more common. And what we're finding is if you don't kind of fix those things upstream first, like GERD, you might be able to get some temporary relief. But if you're not fixing kind of the upper part of the digestive tract, it could potentially still leave those floodgates open later on. So really important to keep that in mind. So what's going on with these medications? So three types, like I said, there's proton pump inhibitors, antacids, H2 blockers known as histamine type 2 receptor antagonists. They could be called H2 antagonists. So let's go over all three. So antacids, these are things like Tums. They're usually the first choice used. They're meant to reduce stomach acid quickly, giving you short-term relief. Usually it happens pretty instantaneously. It's like within a few minutes. Now, while this is great, this can provide some temporary relief, does not get to the root cause as to why you are feeling the reflux in the first place. Keep that in mind. H2 blockers. So these are not as fast acting, but their effects tend to last longer. So H2 blockers, they're things like Pepsid AC, Tagamet, Zantac. So they work by blocking a substance in the body that encourages the production of stomach acid. So that's kind of their mechanism. PPIs are the third type of drug that we commonly see. These are things like Prevacid, Nexium, Prilosec. These are PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. How they function is they permanently block an enzyme that tells your stomach to produce acid. Also, there's a hydrogen potassium pump, ATPase. There's kind of a hydrogen potassium ATPase that's a pump in these cells that allow you to kind of produce this acid. If those are not functioning properly, that enzyme's not functioning properly, we don't produce the hydrochloric acid in the stomach that we need to do its job. So now again, these are also considered to be permanent, but it's relative to the life of the cells of the stomach. And stomach cells tend to only last somewhere between like 3 and 5 days. So important to kind of keep that in mind. Now, under normal circumstances, your stomach pH should be very low, which means it's a very acidic environment. This is what we want. Now, there's a lot of confusion about acid-base balance in the body, but in the stomach, we want a very acidic environment. And that's for a few reasons. One is to help break down protein. One is to extract certain nutrients. And the other is to potentially kill off any bacteria, microbes that could become issues down the road if they are able to survive, say, in a higher pH condition, a more alkaline condition. So usually the stomach pH is very low. We're talking about somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 on that scale. And remember, pH is a logarithmic scale. So, that there's a huge difference in from 1.5 to 2.5 is my point. What these drugs do is they actually raise the stomach's pH, making a more alkaline ballast, a less acidic environment. And it could raise it by as much as 2 points. So 2 points on a logarithmic scale, that could potentially be a 100 times less acidic environment. So even though it sounds linear, it's really not when you're putting that together on the scale that it's valued on. So kind of important to kind of keep that in mind. If the pH is chronically high, if it is chronically more alkaline, what happens is the sphincter actually closes partially. It is a chemoreceptor. It responds to the pH in the stomach. So if it is too basic, if it is too alkaline, that lower esophageal sphincter does not close like it should, and it stays open. And when that stays open, you get reflux. And now we're seeing how you're going to take another, antacid or PPI to mitigate the symptoms right now, but also it's not fixing the problem. It actually potentially could be making it worse because that sphincter is not closing properly. So it leads to kind of this downward spiral. And if you take these for long term, it could lead to a state known as hypochlorhydria, which is low stomach acid, which is associated with things like iron deficiency, B12 deficiency, autoimmune conditions, SIBO, gut disorders down the road, asthma, diabetes, chronic fatigue, and others like allergies. So you see how if we don't take care of the gut on the front end, it could lead to downstream effects like these autoimmune conditions like SIBO, like other gut disturbances or like other gut disturbances, excuse me, that become an issue long term. Other things that antibiotics, PPIs, H2 blockers, if you take them for long term, you're looking at potential opening, other uses or other causes, excuse me, that can cause GERD are things like H. pylori infections, which most people have, but the question is it active? So it's estimated somewhere like 50% of adults actually have H. pylori. The question is it kind of to the point where it's kind of overriding other systems? Poor nutrition, which eats important. We're going to get to that. Chronic stress, eating too quickly, so much. Reflux can actually be fixed by just simply being present with your food, taking your time, showing some gratitude for that, chewing your food at least 20 times. We have the best juicers we have in the world. They're all in our mouths. We just kind of have to use them. And not chewing our food, not doing that mechanical digestion that is chewing, that taxes, remember, everything else down the digestive chain. The next thing down that chain is the stomach. So if that gets overburdened, if you're stressed out, if you're not chewing your food, if we're not getting enough nutrition, all of these are going to potentially lead to downstream issues that, again, the stomach is kind of the next thing on down the chain. So when that gets affected, it's going to affect everything after it. Other things that can affect stomach acid levels are NSAIDs, especially if you overuse them. SIBO, now that kind of goes back and forth like we're talking about. Food sensitivities, particularly if you're continuing to consume foods that you are sensitive to. And also aging. So actually, we tend to produce less stomach acid as we age. So kind of as we get older, this is something to kind of keep in mind because, again, the stomach's kind of has to still do our job. Now, when we don't have enough stomach acid, we're not able to break down protein in the stomach. Like I mentioned, large proteins then make their way into the small intestine. And if they're too large, this is going to place a great deal of stress on the pancreas to produce enough protease enzymes to break those down. So a lot of that should already be done in the stomach. And then again, those proteins are further broken down in the small intestine to be broken down into amino acids and then assimilated. But if they're too big, if the stomach acid is not doing its job because we simply don't have enough, or we're not chewing our food properly, or we're not making enough hydrochloric acid, you're going to put more stress on the pancreas. And we know the pancreas has a lot of different functions, one of which is, again, insulin control, because it is responsible for creating those enzymes, and the beta cells of the pancreas are the ones that produce insulin. So when we start getting some sort of pancreatic dysfunction, you could already see how this could potentially affect blood sugar levels. So important to kind of keep that in mind as you're going here. So as the pancreas wears down, as the enzyme stores run thin, this can lead to things like gut irritation, malabsorption, maldigestion. Now, malabsorption, maldigestion are kind of two different things. Maldigestion refers to our ability to break down the food we eat, while malabsorption is our inability to absorb the nutrients from what is broken down. So the maldigestion is the breaking down of foods. Malabsorption is our ability or not to absorb it. So if we're not producing enough pancreatic enzymes because we don't have enough stomach acid, or the pancreas is overworked because we're not producing enough stomach acid, either way, this can lead to fat and protein malabsorption down the road and maldigestion because they're not producing enough of what we need to break them down into their smallest parts so they could be absorbed. So that's where an issue comes in. This leads to incomplete digestion. When you have incomplete digestion, this could potentially lead to things like leaky gut. And when we see leaky gut, we tend to see triggers for autoimmune type reactivity. So things like RA or psoriasis or lupus or, skin rashes. It could be all the way down the road, acne. All of these things are gut related to a degree. And again, this could all potentially be triggered from the stomach. So kind of important to keep that in mind. Other things that can play a role here, ulcers, if there's issues with gallbladder, mentioned stress, allergies, enzyme deficiencies. Again, some of these kind of go both ways. Is it a chicken or the egg thing? It's important to kind of check that to kind of see where we can go and where we could start. Now, there are a couple tests you can do at home to see if you are producing enough stomach acid to begin with. So one of those is the baking soda test. So in this test, what you do is, well, since baking soda is basic, stomach acid is acidic, hence the name. So when they're combined, they release a gas. So on an empty stomach, if you take, say, like a quarter teaspoon of baking soda, you could add it to a glass of water. You can drink it and then kind of chill out, set a timer for like 3 minutes. So if you start experiencing some belching, some burping, some digestive discomfort, this actually means that you do have adequate amounts of stomach acid if you're getting a reaction kind of within the first 3 minutes, because that gas was created. We had a base and an acid come together. This is, the volcano experiment you did for in science class in, third grade. It's kind of recreating that in your own body. If you're not, if you're not getting a reaction or you have a minimal reaction, then you might have to do a hydrochloric acid challenge test. So these are things you can try at home. What you do here, again, normal stomach acid levels are usually within 1.5 to about 2.5. That's the pH range that they're usually in. So what you start with this is you're going to have probably a betaine hydrochloride supplement available, and you're going to consume a meal and usually these tend to be slightly larger meals, ones that have at least 20-ish grams of protein. So probably like one of your main meals of the day. And you take the pill about halfway through your meal, during your meal at some point. Monitor how you feel over the next hour or so. So here's what you want to watch out for. So if you have enough stomach acid and you add even more, then you'd expect to see some kind of, reaction. So if you feel symptoms that you normally don't, say like gas, bloating, burping, some sort of digestive discomfort, chances are you probably have a high enough level of stomach acid, an adequate level of stomach acid. But if you normally experience these and they don't disappear, then, we might have to bump this up. We can kind of repeat this over time. So, if you experience no symptoms or minimal symptoms, this is kind of an indicator that there might be low levels of hydrochloric acid. So with that, we can try the test again the next day. That will go from maybe one, if you're using one capsule, we could bump that up to two. And we repeat this, if we get to a point where we finally have some of those reactions or not, we do it up to like 5 days. If we get beyond that point, it's time to really start chatting with a practitioner and finding the root cause and trying to fix it. But I would not go past that on your own. I would not, again, none of this is obviously medical advice, but these are things that you can do at home that are fairly safe and that you can get some decent information from. So those are two things that you can kind of do at home to get some idea of, are you producing enough stomach acid? And if so, then we could kind of look somewhere else if there are issues, or, if you're getting relief of symptoms, then that's probably a sign that this is something we have to kind of introduce or get the stomach working as best it can. So that's kind of where we're at. Now, the question is kind of what we can do. Well, first, and this is so important, I cannot stress this enough, is do not, please, 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 do not ignore symptoms. If you suppress them, if you continue to take these medications long term, they're going to lead to bigger issues down the road, like some of those we mentioned, like ulcers, potential autoimmune issues, other gut disturbances, SIBO, IBS, IBD. These are all things, again, when you disrupt the digestive process upstream, it's going to affect everything that comes after it in one way or another. So If you have symptoms, now's the time to start listening to them and incorporate some of the things that we're going to talk about here. So, some of the things that are really, really important. One thing that I would say is really important is we have to incorporate more fruits and vegetables. These it's going to take a little bit of time, likely, especially if you're not consuming a lot of fiber. But if you're consuming mostly meals that are primarily made up of things like vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, um, beans, and legumes, these are going to be the primary foods that are going to help heal the gut long term. Now, you're going to have to work your way up to that. I talk about this a ton, but that's going to kind of be the baseline. Ideally, we want to get a variety of different colored fruits and vegetables so we can support the detoxification pathways as best we can and get the whole litany of antioxidants we need for the liver to do its job and to begin the healing process. Clean water. Clean water is always a big one. If you have a good filter, we have a clearly filtered one. I also like Berkey. I also like Aqua True. I think those are some of the best filters out there right now. If there is some sort of gut imbalance, introducing fermented foods is generally a good idea. If you have issues with fermented foods, then again, we kind of have to look back. Maybe there's a SIBO thing going on, and we kind of have to address that and then kind of come back. But the biggest thing you're going to want to do is to cut out the processed foods for GERD. This is going to be the most important part here is the inflammatory stuff, the simple sugars, simple carbohydrates, the processed foods, the candies. Carbonated drinks sometimes are really big issue. Sugary drinks, even fruit juices, if they're the commercially bought ones. Energy drinks are brutal. Caffeine, so coffee can be an issue here. Alcohol, artificial sweeteners, fried foods are especially brutal when it comes to GERD and is one of the big, um, usually one of those foods that comes up is when you get the most symptomatic are with fried foods. But again, caffeine, alcohol, everything I've mentioned, all of which is going to play a role to some degree. Ideally, if we can get rid of some of the inflammatory oils, vegetable oils found in the processed foods, in the fried foods, and for some people, spicy food, eliminating spicy food as hard as that is, and that hits me hard, because I love spicy food. But if this is something that is giving you an issue, if you're getting reflux, you know, taking it back a notch on all these is going to be one of the best things you can do, especially short term, to start getting some relief here. So, really, really, really important to kind of keep that in mind. What you want to do is give yourself some space before bedtime, between your last meal and bedtime. Ideally, you would like to finish eating 2 to 3 hours before bed. Sometimes intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding can be helpful for this. Not everyone loves doing that, and it's not something that's an absolute necessary, but is an absolute. But what is useful, what is very helpful, is if you can finish eating a few hours before bedtime to give yourself a chance to start digesting that food. It will help, particularly with the sleeping end of things. And another thing that you might want to do is elevate the head of your bed. Maybe you have to stack 2 or 3 pillows behind your head. So, you're not getting that reflux in the middle of the night and you could sleep a little bit better. Another thing that you might want to look at, is you want to limit liquid consumption during meals, even water sometimes. So, like, if you're drinking, say, like 16, 24 ounces of water with a meal, that's going to dilute because the pH of pure water is 7. You're going to be diluting stomach acid if you're consuming a lot of water, or really most liquids, with a meal. So, to get the best digestion, or the most out of the digestive process, you might want to drink less water during the meal. You want to drink it before and after if you can. Give yourself 30 minutes, an hour before and after meals to digest. Don't really want more than maybe like 4 ounces or so of water in that span if you can. If you want to help kind of give, your digestive juices a bit of a kick to kind of get going, you might want to try apple cider vinegar, with a meal. That is something you could do. That is something you can dilute in water a little bit to kind of stimulate that a little bit. You can also consider herbs like DGL, which is licorice, orange peel, chamomile, fennel, ginger, marshmallow, gentian root, papaya. All of these can be helpful in in acting as a buffer for heartburn, but also stimulating the digestive process a bit so that we can, get some of that digesting as best as possible. Finally, man, this is a long one again. I gotta shorten these somehow. So the last to address the stomach acid levels. So we mentioned some of the herbs that are really useful, and I find a lot of help with that, along with being present with your meals, along with chewing your food, along with eliminating what we just talked about. What you can do is introduce things like pancreatic enzymes and betaine HCl. So these are going to help reduce the load on the stomach, kind of give you a chance. Again, based on that test that we talked about earlier, you can work up until you start having symptoms, and then you slowly peel back the hydrochloric acid until you can reintroduce it. So what do I mean by that? So say if I do the test over 3 days and I have no symptoms, but the third day on 3 caps of betaine HCl, I finally feel something. I get that gas, that burp. Now I know that's my limit. So I work back to 2 until I have symptoms again. And then I work back and then I take another one out. And then I work back with 1 until I have it. And then I could finally wean off. So there is a way that you can wean yourself off of this over time while also improving your stomach's ability to produce enough stomach acid on its own. Now, again, there's a bit of an art to it, like I was talking about, because it's not like everyone reacts the same way, but it is kind of a foundation that you can work with someone on, including me, if that's something you want to do. Then we could kind of work on that and find the other root causes kind of as we go along. So I hope that makes sense. Other things, other micronutrients that are going to play a role, particularly when it comes to the inflammation in the stomach that's going to be causing an issue here. So our inflammatory antioxidants, excuse me. So things like zinc, selenium, A, C, E, copper, iron to a degree, like all of these things are really, really useful for detoxification. They're needed in one way or another to help the liver do its job and then excrete things appropriately. Vitamin D, optimizing omega-3, 6 fatty acid ratios. Magnesium, that's something that particularly Americans are really um, deficient in. Also, nutrients like B12 are really important because B12 is one of the nutrients that is actually absorbed in the stomach via the stomach acid. So even if you are a meat eater, if you happen to consume animal products, and that's a talk for a separate day, but if you are having issues with GERD, that is going to affect your ability to absorb B12 and iron. So something to kind of keep in mind. Again, if we can introduce fermented foods, these are going to be great. Sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, fermented foods, all of these are going to be great. Miso, kimchi, everything in between, all of those are going to be good. So those are kind of the overview. I know that's a lot, but that's the overview of kind of how GERD can be addressed. There's obviously a lot of things to kind of personalize and pick from person to person, like what might be most important to start with for someone, what it makes the most sense for that person's life. That's obviously where the kind of personal touch of all this comes in. So, if you have any questions, if this is something that, you're interested in, obviously you can reach out to me about it. I'm more than happy to help, work together on something like this. So you can reach out to me either through my website or in the DMs. Thank you for tuning in today. You could check again everything that I have to offer out, or you can reach out to me directly at drvincentesposito@gmail.com. You can check out my website at insideouthealthwellness.com. Thank you for tuning in. I will talk to you guys soon. Have a good one.